Welcome to another episode of the ArmChair Theologian. Many of you that know me know that I love to work with wood. And in light of that, I thought I'd start a new series that I'm just entitling Woodshop Wisdom! It's going to be a series where we're going to be looking at selected chapters from the book of Proverbs. Today we're going to be looking at Proverbs chapter 4. And so I chose to come down to the woodshop to sort of talk about some of the principles that I guess turning wood and working with wood is very similar to what we're doing when we are molding and shaping ourselves into the image of Christ. And what I really want to say is that we're not really doing the work ourselves. We're really letting God shape us. And so in light of that, I was reminded of wonderful passages in the Old Testament where it talks about how God is always in the process of shaping and changing us. One of the passages is one of my favorites. Is found in Jeremiah 18. It talks simply about Jeremiah going down to the potter's house and looking at the way that the hands of the potter is moving and shaping and sculpting. It's just an intimate and beautiful passage of how God is shaping us into something that's even more beautiful, more amazing than we can possibly imagine at this moment. Now, I'm not a potter, and I'm not really a carpenter. I'm more just a wood turner. So a little boy once sat for weeks watching a sculptor chip away at his marble block until one day this beautiful, magnificent lion emerged. The boy turned to the sculptor and he said, "Hey, mister, how did you know that there was a lion inside that marble?" The sculptor turned to the little boy and said, "In reality, a sculptor must know the lion on a deep and intimate level before he can ever hope to recognize it in a block of marble." And I got to thinking about that, and I started thinking about some of the things that I do with wood, and I was realizing that this is much like what God does to us. We don't always know what shape we're going to take after the chipping and the pounding and the shaping is done, but it almost always is something that's much different than we would ever possibly imagine ourselves. God is the master sculptor, the master turner, the master potter. He understands the clay and the medium he's using on a very intimate level, and he knows exactly the image he's trying to bring that piece to be. And so in this process of learning how to grow spiritually, we're calling this like spiritual formation. It's important that we understand that although we may not know what we're going to be like in the end, he does. And he is guiding us and shaping us. And so we're going to be starting a project, not just working with the Bible. We're also going to be working with a block of wood. A few weeks ago, I was out camping with some friends, and there was this giant stump that was sort of right in the middle of the campsite. Somebody had cut this tree down and left this stump. The stump must have been about 3 feet out of the ground. And one of the guys turned and said, this would make a really great a chair. Let's cut the back off of this. Let's make it sculpt it into a chair. And so they set to work, and we took the chainsaws out, we cut it down, we took the axes out and the mauls out, and we just chipped off a big chunk of the wood and turned it into a nice chair that one of the little kids in the campsite was able to sit on. And as we were doing that, I started to look at some of the pieces of wood that came off of there, and I started to see with more than just the eye of looking for firewood. I started to look with the eye of a wood turner. And I started to look at what the potential could be in some of these pieces of wood. So I actually brought a couple of those home because I thought I wanted to do something with them. So here's one piece. You can look and see just how ugly this is. I mean, this is in no condition whatsoever to be able to do anything with at this point in time. But I saw this and I thought to myself, man, this has some really good grain in here. It's got some solidness to it that would be just amazing. And I thought to myself, maybe I could make something out of this. And so I brought that one home, and then I found this other piece that we had also pulled out of that stump. And I thought, man, this is even uglier. This is even more useless, maybe? But then I started to look deeper at it, and I said, wow, I think there's some things in here that I can actually use. And so I started to pull this out, and I'm going to use one of these pieces of wood yet. I'm not really sure which, but it's not ready yet. The first thing you need to do is start chipping off the outer edges. You need to bring it into a shape that's going to be a little more conducive to turning it on the lathe. And so I'm probably going to use maybe this piece just because it's a little smaller and almost almost ready for me to work. And so the first thing we need to do with this is to take the bandsaw and to sort of trim it down and make it into a rough circle, and get sort of the big edges out of the way so we can actually do some turning on it. Because the Lord is always trying to shape us. In Psalm chapter 119, verses 41 through 48, that passage talks quite a bit about the whole shaping process of mankind. The Word of God says, "Let your steadfast love come to me, O Lord, your salvation according to your promise. Then shall I have an answer for him who taunts me, for I trust in your word. And take not the word of truth utterly out of my mouth, for my hope is in your rules. I will keep your law continually forever and ever. And I shall walk in a wide place, and I have sought your precepts. I will also speak of your testimonies before kings, and shall not be put to shame. For I will find my delight in your commandments, which I love, and I will lift up my hands towards your commandments, which I love, and I will meditate on your statutes." Now, that particular passage is about a shaping of us. You start right in the beginning, the very first verse in verse 41 in Psalm 119. He says, "Let your steadfast love come upon me, O Lord." One of the translations, which I don't normally use for my own particular study, but as I was looking at this passage and going through the different versions, I came across one of the versions that talked about your steadfast love shapes me according to your salvation and your promise. And I thought about that. I thought about the concept of what it means to be shaped by the steadfast love of God. And that's what it means. I mean, think about our kids. I have 4 children of my own and a foster daughter that we recently acquired. And it's not easy to shape individuals into adults. It's not easy to shape their hearts and their minds because kids are like adults. They're willful. They have their own desires, their own wants. And I think sometimes that's one of the most difficult challenges we have as being a parent, is trying to help our kids guide and grow without destroying their own will. I mean, we want to conform them, but we don't want to do it so much so that they're incapable of acting as independent adults when they get to be an adult age. And that's a challenge. Every parent has to go through that. So that's sort of the beginning of this process. I'm going to go ahead and cut that block of wood like I was telling you about, and we're going to come back on camera in a minute, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. And afterwards, we're also going to dive a little bit into the book of Proverbs, chapter 4. So hang on for just a second. So we went ahead and shaped that wood, and you'll notice when I was shaping it that I saved a lot of the pieces, because wood's one of those interesting things is that even the littlest piece you can usually make something or do something with. And so what I have here now is a rough form, an outline, if you will. So if you liken this to when we come to our walk with Christ, a lot of times that initial piece of wood that's found in the woods, the initial find, that's what God does when he reaches out to us and he finds us for that first moment. And in that finding, he understands that in many ways it's like a diamond in the rough, and he wants to be able to shape it and mold it. He sees the potential. He understands it for what it is, because he's intimately familiar with the image and the shape that he wants you to be when he's done. And so he'll bring that rough log back, and he begins the process of shaping. And let me tell you something, the first few cuts that you make on this, I sped it up on the video, so you may not have noticed, but some of those cuts were kind of hard. Some of those cuts were a little tough. I mean, I've got a brand new and very sharp saw in my bandsaw, but even so, there are times when it would hit a spot in the wood that it just wouldn't grip like it needed to. It's almost like the wood was refusing to be cut. But now I turned that shape that it was into a more of a round shape. Now it's coming into focus. Now, you know I'm a wood turner. I'm going to put it on the lathe. I'm looking at this, and it's going to be a bowl, or it's going to be a plate, or it's going to be something that's round, right? And so that's the process that I'm beginning with this. But right now, it's still just an ugly block of wood. In fact, I could pitch this in the fireplace and never think twice, except for the fact that I know that this has potential to be something beautiful. And we're going to turn this into something beautiful over the next couple of weeks as we begin to turn and shape and mold it. But I wanted to turn our attention for just a few minutes to the book of Proverbs. We're going to spend a lot of time in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 4 is one of these wonderful passages that talks quite a bit about a father passing down his wisdom to his son. And I quite like that idea. When I was growing up, my father always had something to say about everything. You know, he always had an opinion, and it wasn't up in an opinion of a blowhard or a scoffer or a mocker. It was somebody that had genuine wisdom, at least in my mind, and I just enjoyed it immensely. In fact, I look back on it, I think the memory of that I enjoy more than the moment at the time that my father was giving me the wisdom. But such as being a child, you don't understand the value of things sometimes when you have it. But when the Bible turns in this mode to like a father speaking to a son or a mother speaking to a daughter, it's such a profound thing, because the father or the mother, not a professional teacher or a pastor or some government official, but a father and a mother has the most profound responsibility and the greatest opportunity to lead a young person in the right way. This passage that we're about to read illustrates how wisdom is an inheritance, that it may be passed from one generation to the next. It's a powerful moment as we seek to bring the next generation to its potential. But it begins with us passing that on to our kids. And it can preserve an entire family line through the passing of years, as wisdom is passed down from one age to the next. It is, however, an inheritance that each generation must choose to receive, and unfortunately, many of our young people are choosing not to receive this wisdom. They're choosing to allow the wisdom to fall on either deaf ears, or they just don't receive it like they need to, and that's a tragic consequence that I think you're seeing played out on the news nightly around the country and around the world. You see, if the chain is broken. If this chain of wisdom is broken, that's passed down from father to son, to mother to daughter, and so on and so forth, if that chain is broken and this way of wisdom is sort of rejected, the results could be utterly disastrous for that family line. And so when this passage is being laid out, and we're just going to take a few minutes to look at it. I'm not going to read the whole chapter to you, because just in interest of time, I want to encourage you to read that on your own. But it's just right in the beginning. It says, "Hear, O sons, a father's instruction." Now, I know a lot of times we read this and we say, well, he's talking to father and son. You know, these gender roles that they're having here are less important than the wisdom being pontificated. And so you could easily say, "Hear, O daughters, a mother's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insight." Either way, the wisdom still is sound. It's talking about this appeal that the father is giving to the son to listen to the wisdom. In verses 1 through 9, it includes this lengthy quote from the teacher's own father. Look what it says in verses 4 through 9. It says, he taught me when I was a son with my father in verse 3, and tender and young in the sight of my mother, he says, my father, he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast to my words, keep your commandments and live. Look what it says, get wisdom, get insight, do not forget, do not turn away from the words of my mouth. He's imploring his son to learn. And obviously the father in this passage learned it from his father and is now passing it on to his own son as he wants this wisdom to carry on. So wisdom is sometimes, in my opinion, wisdom is the greatest single possession that any of us can have. A young man should make winning wisdom the primary goal of his life. Think about that. When Solomon was presented with all the possible potentials of the universe, he could have been handed anything and everything that he ever wanted. He chose one thing. He said, give me wisdom. You know, it's an idea that wisdom is one of the most important things that we can seek in our lives. So I want to turn to the final part of this chapter as we are learning to shape this, and then I'm going to get to work a little bit on trying to begin to shape this bowl, and hopefully I'll catch some of that on camera for you guys. But in verse 20 comes that 20 through 27 is that final appeal that the father is making to his son in this passage. He says, my son, be attentive to my words, incline your ear to my sayings. Let them not escape your sight. Listen, look at what he's saying. He's bringing in all these sensory ideas. He's asking his son to, by using the metaphorical body images and these parts to sort of that permeate this text. He's saying the eyes need to be fixed on the right teaching. The feet, he says later on, stays on the right path. The lips shun evil. Look what it says. My son, be attentive to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. Let them not escape your sight. Keep them in your heart, for they are life to those who find him, and healing to all their flesh. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. Put away from your crooked speech, and put devious talk far from you. Let your eyes be directed forward, and your gaze straight before you. Ponder the path at your feet, and then all your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or to the left, and turn your foot away from evil. It's a powerful passage. And look what he says about the heart in verse 23. You know, the heart, this wellspring of life is what it really means. You know, this heart is the seat of everything. You know, we oftentimes think about, because we, in our day and age, we have differentiated between the heart and the soul and the mind. And we oftentimes think that our differentiation that we have also is the same differentiation that the Old Testament prophets had. That's not the case. You see, the heart was always, it didn't just refer to the physical organ, but to the mind and the personality and the wholeness of the individual. It was literally the wellspring of life. And in that capacity to live with joy and vigor ultimately comes not from circumstances, but from within ourselves. And the ancient Hebrew understood what it meant when it says, with your heart you make these decisions. A corrupt heart draws one down to the grave, but wisdom protects the heart from that corruption. This verse, in conjunction with maybe Ezekiel's river of life in Ezekiel chapter 47 that Jesus drew from when he was speaking in John chapter 7 verse 38 about out of the heart will flow rivers of living water, this wellspring of life that he's trying to encourage us to draw from. When we start to allow God to shape us and to mold us, this is what we're talking about. He's talking about permeating us with the wisdom of the Holy Spirit that dwells within us, and using that wisdom from our elders and from our God and from the Spirit that dwells within us to guide us on those right paths, to move us and to shape us and to keep us moving the way he wants to. You know, the neat thing about Christianity, and you see it so clearly in the book of Mark and many times in the Old Testament, the idea of this constant movement that's happening. You know, it's no mystery to me why God chose to reveal his word in such a way of a constant movingness, right? The children of Israel traveled, Abraham was called from his home and moved to a different place. He wandered around in Canaan, went to Egypt, came back from Egypt. He settled a little bit. His son settled a little bit. And then Jacob eventually worked his way down to Egypt. And then Egypt, the nation grew large, and they came back and wandered in movement. You see a constant movement. They look for the Holy Land, but the Holy Land is just really a metaphor for the heaven that we're eventually going to attain. And so we see this constant movement we found in Scripture, and that's what God is trying to show us here, is that in this movement of our walk, even our walk with Christ, when we say our walk with Christ, we're talking about movement words, right? We are moving with the Spirit as He leads. And He may lead us here for a season. He may lead us somewhere else for a season. But we need to be attentive. We need to be obedient. And we need to go where He tells us to go, say what He tells us to say, and do what He tells us to do. And it all begins by listening to the wisdom of our elders, the wisdom of our God through His Word, and the wisdom through discernment that He gives us in His Spirit that dwells within us. And so this is where we're going with this series as we look at some wisdom from the Woodshop. So that's all I have tonight. I encourage you to continue to read through some of the passages that I've given you in Psalm chapter 119 and in Proverbs chapter 4 as we continue to move on. I would encourage you this week and leading up till next Wednesday, if there is a passage in the book of Proverbs that you would like to expound upon or you think sort of would fit within this series that we're talking about, I would encourage you to email it to me, text message it to me. I'll be more than happy to look at it and maybe expound a little bit on it so that we can draw out the words of wisdom from our Father in heaven so that we might have that path in front of us so that we won't swerve to the right or left and we'll keep our feet away from evil, which is what He's saying in His Word. So I encourage you to think about this, ponder on this, talk it over with your family this week, and meet us next week as we look forward to another episode of the ArmChair Theologian. And again, thank you for joining us.